we have to get really clear about the fact that any kind of sex without full consent is rape. We also don't want to accept that people we know and trust and love and are friends with are capable of doing that. It's not only bad people that do this, it's people who have made bad decisions.
Hi, I'm Amisha, and this is episode 10 of the Future is Beautiful podcast. We have some great news. We're number 3 in the iTunes top podcast list this week for philosophy in the UK and number 1 in the US, as well as being in the top 50 for society and culture in both countries. Thank you to each of you for listening, sharing, and supporting this. This week, I'm joined by Imogen Butler-Cole, who most recently has created a piece of theatre called Foreign Body, which explores surviving sexual assault. I have to warn you that some of you may find some of this conversation triggering, as it might bring up experiences from your past. If this happens, please do reach out to friends or helplines that can support you through the process. We share some on our blog. I feel that this is a really important conversation to be having, as we're re-understanding the sexual power dynamics in society. Please listen to this episode, whether man or woman, and be gentle with yourself with what arises from it. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. This week I'm joined by Imogen Butler-Cole, who is an actress and writer who has created an incredible piece of theatre called Foreign Body, which is looking at sexual assault. Imogen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about the show that you've created?
Yeah, sure. So it's a 45-minute solo play, and so I'm the performer. I based the story on my own experiences of sexual assault and healing after sexual assault. And to begin with, it was really just based around my story, but I wanted to open up the conversation to involve stories of other women, their experiences as well. So it now has the voices of 8 other women who are also survivors and also the perpetrator of one of my assaults. So although it's a solo performance, I'm the only one on stage, all of the conversation happens in voiceover. So that was what enabled me to open it up and bring those other voices in.
It's such a powerful piece, and when I knew that you were doing it, it took me a while before I actually wanted to go and see it, because the material, the content is very confronting for everyone, whether you've had an experience similar as a woman or whether as a man you've wondered if you ever crossed a line that you weren't fully aware of, or anything in between, just if you've supported someone else through something. And I feel like it took me about a year before I actually came to the show, because I was like, okay, that's really great that you're doing that, and I'm not ready to go and see it. And when I did go and see it, it is so powerful, and it brought up a lot. I think I emailed you that night or the next day and started sharing stories. I don't know if everyone that goes to see the show does that.
Probably not everyone, but a lot of people do. And that for me is one of the most rewarding things about it, really, that I think it seems to help people process their own experiences. Like you say, mostly other survivors, but there have actually been men who've seen it as well, and not directly to me, but through a friend. I had one story of a guy saying afterwards, God, that's really made me think about things that I've done in the past. because I think one of the things that the play does is explore a whole range of sexual assault, from the things which I myself in the past have described as kind of borderline because of 3 assaults which happened to me, which are all explored in the show. 2 of them were not, the common description of rape. So for me at the time, I didn't recognise that as assault. It took me a long time and hearing other people's stories actually to be able to process what had happened to me. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring in other stories as well, because I wanted to kind of show the whole spectrum of the different kinds of rape, sexual assault, sexual abuse that happen to people within relationships, to the more typical, what we understand as typical stranger rape, which actually isn't that typical at all, because I think around 90% of rape and sexual abuse actually takes place within relationships or by people that we know already. But yeah, so there have been many people who have written to me after the show, whether on email or messages or even letters, so from people that I know and also people that I haven't met, saying that it's helped them to process and helped them to realise what happened to them has been assault as well. And that's really rewarding, and it really makes the hard work and the kind of fear actually of putting this on worth it, because I think if it can start anyone on the journey of processing what happened, then that's a positive thing. And I know actually in my case, one of the things that helped me identify what had happened to me was hearing other people's stories. And like I said, I didn't identify it at the time because it's not what we commonly understand as being rape, as being sexual assault. So it was not until I heard a news report of something very similar, and 2 guys were going to jail for what had happened. And that really hit me. God, if that's possible, then what happened to me must be significant, It's much more significant than I had previously given it credit for being, if that's the right expression. And another kind of turning point for me was when I heard the stories, actually read them first, of another couple of women whose voices are now in the play, who I'd encountered through the Forgiveness Project, which is this brilliant charity that exists to talk about stories of forgiveness, and also to do reconciliation work in prisons. And there were 2 women on the Forgiveness Project website who shared stories about their own stories of rape and sexual abuse. And the very fact that they were able to tell their stories, and one of them does so anonymously, but one of them is public about it, and she does public speaking, and it really, that was what really enabled me to think, okay, I can actually make a piece of theatre, make a play about my experiences. If for me hearing her story has enabled me to do that, then perhaps my making that story can do something similar for other people.
Yeah, it's important work, and we all witnessed with the metoo week on Facebook this pouring of sharing from almost every woman that you were friends with on Facebook, sharing some kind of story of feeling objectified or taken advantage of or assaulted in some way. And that week was so powerful, and also the men that then came forward and said it was me and shared their stories, or how they might have. Even one friend shared that he'd sat and he'd gone back on all of his sexual experiences, and he felt quite clean about it, except he realised that sometimes when there was mixed signals, he would take the yes over the no, and that was the thing that he had done. And actually, when he really tuned in to himself and into those moments, he would have preferred to have been a man that had taken the no rather than the yes from a mixed signal. And that's been a really powerful opening for a lot of women, and now all of these glamorous women of Hollywood sharing their stories and making this a much more kind of normalised conversation. But when I first saw your play, that was before all of this, and for me, having had experiences that, again, aren't dark alley, stranger, like horrific experiences, but generally experiences where it's been friends, where we've, been staying in the same house, where all of those safety aspects weren't there because there was a lot of trust in the scenario, and then those lines being crossed, and I had definitely come away from those experiences thinking, okay, well, that was my fault because we were hanging out, maybe there was alcohol involved, he was at my house anyway, I let that happen, maybe it's not that big a deal, maybe I just need to get over it, I don't understand why I feel so strange about it, like why do I still feel strange about it so long afterwards, and all of these things that happen, and then this shame, I felt a lot of shame of admitting even to myself that something had happened in my kind of sexual life that hadn't been like empowered and choice and loving, and like by having that happen, that I had somehow done something wrong. I didn't plan on opening this episode with sharing in that way, but it's kind of, it's like letting go that there's anything big to share, by recognizing that it's important, and so it is big, but it's big in the sense that it's important, and just like we talk about so many other issues, this is one that we do need to talk about, men and women.
Yeah, there's so much in there that that I'd really love to respond to, and I think the first thing being, you just described so many of the kinds of responses which I think very many of us survivors, both men and women, right? But so many of the kinds of responses that we have when we've survived sexual assault, the shame, the self-blame, the belief that we allowed it to happen, we were responsible, not wanting to believe that this is something that happened to us, and also then minimizing it as well. Oh, it doesn't really count, it wasn't so bad for me, therefore, I shouldn't be making such a fuss, I shouldn't be, I don't deserve any kind of support or therapy or processing or whatever it might be, I'm just being self-indulgent. Or, there's so many of these kind of really, these responses of denial that I think so many of us have. And one of the things that was very helpful for me in that was Madeline Black, who's one of the voices in the play, who, as I mentioned, I met through the Forgiveness Project, who said to me, actually, when I contacted her saying, oh, what happened to me wasn't so much, like it wasn't so important. And she said, please don't compare. It's not about comparison. There's no level of this stuff. It's all just about how we respond to it individually. And for me as well, it had been 10 years since what happened, 10 or 12 years, because, as I say, there were these 3 different incidents, until I actually realised what had happened was assault. And there was part of that which was about suppression. I didn't want to see it like that. Part of it was about the fact that when we go through trauma, our memory doesn't hold on to those things. So, a lot of it was quite unclear to me. So many reasons why it took me that long to come to it. And like I said earlier, this thing about actually having the language, actually having the understanding that something can constitute a sexual assault. And for me, actually, to kind of go into that and the terminology around it, the incident which I had seen on the news and which helped me to recall what had happened to me was described as digital penetration, digital assault. And obviously that means with one's fingers, and that was what had happened to me, and that was why these guys were going to jail. And it just was extraordinary to me that something like that could have such a heavy penalty, because in this country, rape is described as being the genitalia being inserted into a part of the body. So, you know, that seemed really insignificant. It seemed like even if I didn't invite that, even if I didn't consent to it, doesn't really count, doesn't really matter, because it's not got that label on it. But so having been given that language really helped me to process what had actually happened. And that's one of the reasons I think this conversation is so important, because if people aren't talking about this stuff, then we're not going to recognise it, then we can't name it, and if we can't name it, then we can't begin to move on. We can't begin to process it. We need to talk about it, right, in whatever safe way we can. And that brings me onto the metoo movement that you were talking about. And I really believe that it's such an important thing that's happening, that people, you know, and for me, I think it's still going on. It was that week that kind of kicked it off, but we're still going through it. And the fact that all people from all walks of life, as you said, almost everyone you know has some kind of story. And I think it's very important that we are open about that and that we acknowledge that. And, you know, it's not safe for everybody to make those kinds of avowals, to come out and speak publicly about those things. But when people describe what's happened to them and the way that it's affected them, I think that also helps us to take steps forward to move away from it, because then maybe if potential perpetrators are hearing those kinds of responses to what's happened to them, perhaps it can also discourage them, you know, from doing similar things again. And that's partly my hope with bringing the perpetrator's voice into Foreign Body, into the play, that because he was completely contrite. I'll speak in a moment maybe about, you know, why I've had the conversation with him and why he's agreed for his voice to be part of the play. But he took full responsibility for what had happened. He was completely contrite. He'd very obviously been carrying this as something awful that he had done for the entire 10, 12 years in the interim, in the way that I had. So because he took such responsibility, because he was so affected by it, I then didn't want to pursue any other kind of, you know, I don't want him to be punished. I think he's living that already, you know, and that's not the case for everybody. Obviously, there'll be people who, you know, their perpetrators are in complete denial and don't want to take responsibility for what has happened. But the fact that he took responsibility and the fact that he's clearly so weighed down by it, I hope as well that if people hear that testimony, men and perpetrators, potential perpetrators, or people who may have done things like that themselves without really realising what a major thing it is, that they might begin to process that differently, and if only help them process things that might have happened, or also maybe discourage people from doing things like that in the future.
And women too, because I'm sure, you know, there are many instances of women using their power in a sexual scenario, especially like women in kind of high places in the workplace or in certain industries. But partly just because of the way that our genitalia works, it falls in a place where it is generally men and women that are. It's funny, you use the word survivors, and every time you say it, something in me is like, that's not me, I'm not a survivor. And then I had to start singing like Destiny's Child in my head to like kind of bring some, because I think for me what happens when you said survivor as a victim thing comes in, and then you're like, well, I'm not a victim, I don't want to carry that, and which of course when the survivor means that, and you come back stronger, and that it's interesting just those languages and just being able to admit where I feel triggered and knowing that this is a really triggering conversation for everyone that's listening. That it's not easy subject matter, and it can be one where it could be like, oh, I think I'll just skip that episode.
Yeah.
But I really hope that people don't, and that we're able to sit with our discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, obviously it's really important that people are kind of looked after in this conversation, and I hope to do that in the play by providing trigger warnings. That's really important, but also by having discussions after the play. Every show that we do is followed by a discussion with myself and with other people who either other survivors or people who are working in the sector, support workers, psychologists, that kind of thing. And we always really focus on self-care. And I'd say that now to anyone who does listen and does find this challenging, either immediately in the moment or after the fact. It could be later today, it could be tomorrow, it could be over the next few days that things kind of bubble up and appear for you. And if that is the case, then I think it's really important to know the things that one can do to take, to practice self-care, essentially, whether it's some meditation or having a bath or calling someone that you need, that you feel you can trust to be supportive, or going for a long walk, or having a big scream, or whatever it is, like knowing that those things are important in processing this stuff, whichever side of the conversation you're on, and interesting, the thing you say about it perpetrating being about genitalia, and obviously women can perpetrate sexual violence too, and women can rape, and it's much less common statistically, but of course it does still happen. And I think it's also a question of that power structure, like you're saying. So it is possible for women in positions of power to take advantage of those positions in order to get what they want, in whatever way that might be, whether it's sexual gratification or it's a power trip or it's this a kind of domination, and I use that in a negative sense rather than in a kind of kinky way, because I do think this conversation is so much around power, and this is a conversation which quite often comes up after the play, and in just conversations generally I find myself having around sexual assault, because there seem to be a couple of camps, people who believe that sexual assault is about sex and people who believe that it's about power. And for me, it seems that it's really a combination of the two, that it is partly for gratification that people perpetrate, but it's also about taking power, taking control, taking domination, taking away someone's choice, that there are some people which seem to get a kick out of that. And I think also there are people that, because we don't talk about this clearly and openly enough, that just don't really understand what constitutes sexual assault and rape, and this belief, that rape is a stranger taking advantage of someone down a dark alley, and there's violence involved over and above the violation of the act itself. And obviously those scenarios happen, but they're much less frequent than either rape happening within relationships or from people that we know, where they just go a little bit far. They just don't hear our no. They just don't understand that we don't actually want to be in that situation, that they push us, that we might resist, and they might think that that's a come on. We have to get really clear about the fact that any kind of sex without full consent is rape. I think it's very difficult for people to hear that, It's very difficult for people to accept that, but that it's not, it's a word that has a lot of stigma around it. It's a word that carries a lot of weight, a lot of trauma, and we don't like to accept that actually it's not such a huge and violent act. It's simply having sex with someone when they don't want to have sex with you, or even initiating it, or even not stopping when you're asked to stop. It doesn't have to be the whole act, right? I mean, it seems in a way absurd to put it like that, but I think it's important because I think people don't necessarily understand it. And also I think that we also don't want to accept that people we know and trust and love and are friends with are capable of doing that. We have this myth again around perpetrators being people who are on the edges of society. They're desperate and they're, maybe psychologically disturbed. But actually, it's our friends, it's our partners, it's our siblings, it's people that we trust. And I think it was really well demonstrated in this horrendous case where Lena Dunham came out and said that a woman, an actress who had been raped by was he the producer or the writer on her show? But this girl had come out and accused someone who worked with Lena Dunham of raping her. And Lena Dunham said, "Oh no, we know that this is one of those cases where it's a false accusation because we know him, because we understand that he couldn't be possible of this. He couldn't be capable of this." And I think it's really important that we understand that people who we know to be good people are also capable of this. It's not only bad people that do this, it's people who have made bad decisions. It's people who've taken advantage of a situation and have probably wanted to put it to the back of their mind. And I think we have to accept that. We have to understand that. And if we, I think there's something about, what if someone we know does, is accused or is, told, we're told that they're a perpetrator. Because I've lived with this myself. But what do we do if we suddenly realise that a person that we know and love has perpetrated? And I think my response is we have to believe people that speak up, because it's so difficult to talk about this stuff. It takes so much courage. It's so frightening, and we risk such exclusion and stigma to speak up about these things. People don't do it lightly. People don't do it for their own gain. The backlash is so immense that we risk so much to speak up about this stuff. We just have to understand that if people are making these accusations, they're doing it for a good reason. They're doing it because it happened. And, there's this whole thing now of, what happened to innocent until proven guilty? Well, that's for the law courts. That phrase is for the legal system. That's for the judges to make their decisions about, and the juries to make their decisions about. For us, our job is to stand with the victims, stand with the survivors, listen to them, believe them, hear them, and support them in whatever way we can.
It's interesting because as you're saying that, and I somebody that's close to me was once accused of something that they were later found not guilty of in a court of law, but it destroyed their career and their life, and so there are instances where people do use their imagination to tell stories in order to get something or to get some power in a situation, and that does add a complication. It
does, but the statistics state, I don't know the precise statistics, but it is so infrequent. The number of false accusations that actually happen versus the number of true accusations that happen versus the number of cases we don't ever even hear about, the numbers of people that never even come forward are so vast that I think it massively outweighs that as a problem. And I mean, if this friend of yours was right and judged correctly, then yeah, I can understand that that's completely horrific. But I know that 90% of people still either don't report their rapes, or when they do, they're not convicted. That's the proportion that we have to be looking at. From my view, that's the problem, that's the issue, that's where we need to be sending out energy and working to make change, because the number of false accusations are absolutely tiny compared to the number of people who are raped daily.
And I mean, the person coming to mind as well also happens to not be white. There are other kind of factors as to why maybe that case went forward and others don't. Because there is definitely a kind of network of protection that exists.
Absolutely. And I mean, saying all of this, for myself as a white woman, I understand that if I wanted to go and report any of these cases that happened to me, I know that I would not be putting myself at risk by doing so. Beyond, it can be very re-traumatizing to go through the judicial process. But women of colour, I understand as well, like there are risks involved in going to court cases. I heard a story recently of a woman who had gone to report a sexual assault, and she was then criminalised, a black woman. And, I live in a world where that hadn't even occurred to me. I hadn't even had to, I hadn't even had to bear that in mind until that point. And I know that there are so many, the system is so much more heavily stacked against surviving, reporting, receiving the right kind of treatment, receiving the right kind of therapy for women of colour than it is for white women. That it's just, it's it's a huge issue and a huge problem. And, the resources, the whole system is so massively under-resourced anyway. Women's shelters, refuges, rape crisis centres are being shut down all over the country for lack of funding. There's just not enough support, and that's for all of us, right? But it's always harder to access that support as a woman of colour as well. So yes, I mean it's on both ends, isn't it?
Yeah. And depending on your economic bracket.
Exactly.
Once we get into the space of the system, of the police, of courts. Yeah. But if we just take it like back away from there and into sort of the more kind of personal, everyday kind of space. It's interesting, is as you were talking about, power, I was thinking of, I ran yoga retreats and I got a taste of what it was like to be kind of in power in that scenario. Just a wonderful guy that was on my retreat. We had a really lovely connection and he wanted something to happen. And for me, I was like, no way, that's an abuse of power. What we're doing here is really vulnerable, and you guys are paying me and I'm holding the space in a certain way. And we know in spiritual circles that not everyone has that opinion when they're holding space in that way. And for me, I said to him very clearly, like, this can't happen. Maybe in a year, if there's something. Because you've also got to be open to where you can meet people. But I was like, in this scenario, it's just not appropriate. But realising how easy it would have been to have done something different just by not thinking it through, or not having proper guidance, support. I feel like I was taught very well in terms of that, and also having female friends that have I had a male yoga teacher. My relationship with him was fine, but I mean, he did send me poems and things, but I just went, oh, that's cute. But I know that if you responded to those poems in a certain way, there was a whole pattern of what it led to. And other friends of mine experienced that with this teacher, and it happens with so many teachers. So it's something that I've really looked into. But if you haven't really thought about it, it's like all of these instances that happen, often, you know, it's poor judgment. Like it's not that person is bad. It's like that person just didn't use their judgment and they completely overstepped a boundary, and that's had huge implications and trauma that both people then have to experience. And that's why these conversations are so important, because until you hear stories of, you know, your story, or a story of how, you know, how sleeping with a friend, like when you've all had too much to drink, how much that might hurt that person for years to come. That's when the consciousness comes that maybe someone in that situation next time, or maybe someone that is then going to be in that situation that's not been in that situation before, will go, oh, like I read all of those Facebook posts from every woman that I know. Now something is shifting in me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just had a flash of that. I've been reading the book The Power, and it's really about shifting the dynamic between men and women kind of taking on power. And a combination of that and the Me Too movement, I think, has really shifted my sense of power. Just being aware that this subject is something that we're talking about now, that people are a little bit more aware of it. I feel, in a way, slightly safer, I think. I feel like people are less likely, men generally, right? I don't think I've ever been groped by women, but men are less likely to just kind of reach out on the street and do something, because we are having an open conversation about it. And it's by no means over, it's by no means solved. But there is a little part of me, I think, now, which is like, you all out there begin to understand what it's like for us. And we've taken a step in the right direction. It feels somewhat safer. Not completely, you know, but there is an element where I feel like we've begun to move on. But also, yeah, the question about power and domination in industries, you know, in workplaces, I think this is a really important conversation, and obviously it's begun to happen in Hollywood, by no means completely, but, and also with the Time's Up movement, I guess the women of Hollywood are hoping that they will now be able to help women in other industries as well find a way of stamping out abuse of power within their industries, and that's, you know, so far remains within the States. And, you know, here I know we're all aware of it and we're reading this stuff, and it kind of, you know, as I've just said, like, it feels like for me something has shifted, but it remains to be seen in this country what steps are going to be taken, whether people are really going to be held to account for systemic abuses of power. Of course, there's been some investigation done into what's happening at Westminster, but it doesn't really feel like much has changed in the film industry. There's not much conversation happening there. There is a little bit within the theatre industry, largely actually happening around the Royal Court. They've taken responsibility to at least have a conversation about it. But I mean, I know instances of abuses of power within this industry, and I'm just as sure as I am of, you know, of it being true in the United States, that it happens through every industry here, and we've got a really long way to go to stamp out the abuse of power. And I was having a conversation with a friend and colleague recently who has been asked to do some advising on a union trying to make steps. And we were saying that it feels like we need workplace guidelines put in place around sexual violence, just like we do for health and safety. You know, because we know now, we begin to understand some people begin to accept that it's such a big issue that there should be guidelines within industries as well to let people know what counts as assault, because like you're saying, we don't always know, or even harassment, you know, all the different things that are inappropriate, all the different things that aren't okay, so that then if someone is being harassed, they've got something to point at, they've got something to go to, and there's a standard to be upheld. And also that, like has been mooted in Hollywood, that we have independent review boards where anyone who is being victimised sexually or through harassment can go and make a report and make a complaint, but they need to be independent bodies, because if they're within the same industry, the trouble is, of course, it's people who remain, who continue to hold power over them. So, yeah, my hope is that we begin to take steps towards having those kinds of insurances put in place, because it's too important, it's too much to turn the blind eye and walk away and turn our backs on this now. We've begun to have the conversation. I really feel like there has to be some way of following it through.
Thank you. When you first had the idea of, okay, I want to write a play and perform myself in a play about this and with your own story, how did that feel? Did it come through as a very like formed, powerful, like, yes, I'm going to do this? Or was it like, was there a kind of like, I feel like it's important, but like I'm a bit scared to share this? Or how did it come about for you?
It was very scary. It has been a lot throughout the process. And it happened very, very slowly. I'd been making a play about sexual violence, but it wasn't my story. And it was based on the Greek myth of Cassandra, who was given the gift of prophecy by the god Apollo, but then when she refused to sleep with him, he wanted to take the gift back, but he couldn't take it back. So he cursed her never to be believed. So she could still see the future, but no one ever believed her. So it was really using her as a metaphor for the silencing of women around sexual violence. But what we discovered was that it wasn't as powerful as it could have been, and we kept getting stuck on the narrative. And my director actually pointed out that very often the most powerful political theatre is real stories, just telling true stories, because then people can't deny them. And it was actually at that point that, as I was saying, I had begun to read the stories on the Forgiveness Project, that I had been inspired by those women telling their stories, and that all of my own history was kind of surfacing at that time, and that I was then inspired by the Forgiveness Project and their reconciliation stuff to get in touch with the perpetrator of one of these assaults, who had been a friend at the time, and I was still distantly, but I was still in touch with. So I contacted him, and as I said, we then had a conversation. He took responsibility, and I finally asked him if he was willing to record his testimony and to have that be part of the play. So then by that point it felt like we had a strong narrative, and so that was kind of the history of the decision to make this piece. And then once I had decided to do it, I contacted these two women from the Forgiveness Project, Madeline Black and another woman, who both agreed to share their stories through the play. And then I knew that I would have these recordings of their stories and also of mine. I kind of interviewed myself, but I didn't really know how it was going to take place on the stage and what was going to happen. And I'd actually been, over the previous couple of years, doing a Tantra course, a series of women's courses. And it was on the final course that we all had to do a dance to a piece of music. And I chose this piece by Niels Fromm, and I danced to it. It was about 8 minutes long, and I was very vulnerable and raw from having done an extremely triggering exercise just leading up to it. And I was feeling really defiant, and I was feeling really very much connected with my body and very sensual, but also kind of enraged by this triggering. And there were all these people watching, and I just kind of stared them down, and I did this very slow movement piece, which just kind of came out of nowhere. And someone said to me afterwards, "Ooh, that was so powerful, like you should use it, you should do something with it." And it was an amazing energy in the room, like something shifted, definitely.
It's like Kali energy.
Yeah, like I actually had painted this, like on my body, the kind of goddess triangle on my womb, and I was doing a lot of Kali practice at the time, actually, so that was really, really strong for me. So then the following week I had a space to do a showing with a theatre company, and I'd planned to just go in and read out my some bits of my testimony just to see how people reacted. But it was at that moment when I realised, God, I could actually just have the recording play, because I already had the recording. So I'd have the recording play and some music, and I could dance. So I did. So I used that same piece of music. I layered the voiceover over that music, and I just did a similar kind of movement piece. And people were kind of a bit blown away by it, because there I was doing this quite sensual, quite kind of ragey dance. And there was this description, which was very vulnerable, about what had happened to me, about being assaulted. And it seemed like that was really effective. And so it just went on developing from there. So that was 8 minutes, and then I developed it to 15 minutes, and I then brought in these other voices and did a half-hour piece, which was the piece that you saw. And then I brought in even more voices again. So as I said, now there are 8 other women, and it's a 45-minute piece, and the design has been completely redeveloped. We have a couple of really beautiful metaphors which we've kind of brought in through the design of the piece. And yeah, it's just developed from there. And in terms of the way that it's felt, it was absolutely terrifying at each step along the way before I showed it for the first time. So before I did that showing I've just described, that was relatively safe because it was in a workshop and there were only going to be a limited number of people there, and we were all trying out and sharing work. But the first time I performed that publicly, I really, just moving up to it, I was just like, why have I agreed to do this? Why am I doing this? I felt very vulnerable, very raw, very afraid, because if something like that goes badly, like I think it could just be so kind of, yeah, you're so vulnerable, and if people don't receive it well, it could have felt just awful. But they received it really well, and then I developed it further, and then the next version of having it again and new information and how was it going to be, and of course, and it's devised theatre, and therefore you're developing it right up to kind of the day before you show it, and you never really know how it's going to end up, and so it's very difficult to predict what people's responses are going to be. And the piece that you saw, it was, yeah, that was also very rough. We'd only had, I think, 4 days to develop that, to make the soundtrack and to splice together all the recordings and to figure out what movement I was going to do. And at that point I was speaking as well, right? There were bits of dialogue as well, so like creating all of that and throwing it together, and was it going to be clear, and you know, what responses are going to be, and also, is it safe for other people to watch this? Is it going to be really triggering? Is it going to be too much for people? Are we holding the space well enough that people are safe within this? And is it positive, you know, having this conversation? And by now, having finally finished the piece and actually being happy with the way it stands, so I won't kind of mess with it anymore, I don't have any of that fear left, because it's always been so well received, and because, as I said earlier on, people have always, and when I say about it being well received, it's really when survivors or victims or people who've been through similar stuff share and say, you know, in some way this has helped. So that just gives me so much energy to do it, that I find it a really positive experience now. And I think part of that is also the fact that it's a physical process. It's a movement piece. I rage on the stage, and then I finally get to this kind of moment of release and freedom at the end. And so going through that process every time is very, I wonder whether to use the word cathartic. I think it is actually. I'm again kind of processing it through my body, and I come out of that always feeling very powerful. And I really enjoy the fact of being able to be on stage in that position, physically strong, and demonstrating that that's possible. You know, as a survivor, it's possible to share our stories and be kind of whole and healed in front of people. And there was one other thing, but it's gone.
Did you come at this like as an artist wanting to share your story, or as an activist wanting to change the conversation, or a bit of both, or has it been one at some times and another at other times?
That's a really good question. I think it's really always been a combination. I wanted to make a play about sexual violence because I cared a lot about it, even before my own stories had come up. And the tool that I have is my craft, right, is theatre making. And so the thing that I feel that I can do that's most useful in terms of activism is make art about it. I can go on marches, I can sign petitions, I can volunteer, give my time to women's organisations, but actually my skill, my craft is around making stories. I think the coming together of those two things is quite powerful when it's like, it's a bit like, it's my calling, you know, it's like those two things together, when they meet, when it's a passion, a cause that I really, really care strongly about, and something that I love doing. It's about sharing, being with a group of people, creating a sense of unity with people, and being creative, giving forth life, that feels really powerful. I don't think I could separate the two, but it certainly feels like it's the most powerful thing that I can contribute, to the discussion. And I've remembered what I wanted to say previously, actually, this thing about the fear. And it's every time before I do the show, I tend to get overwhelmed with exhaustion. And I think it's almost like my body saying, I don't want to do this again, because it's not only the rage and the release, but it's also kind of going through right from the beginning, the denial, the tension in my body, the unraveling the story, listening to other women's stories, finally beginning to accept what's happened to me, and then processing that. So it is a bit like going through the whole story, the whole process, every time I do it on stage. So that's something which I've only recently realised, actually, that there's always quite a resistance that builds up in me before doing it. But then doing it is a bit like processing it again. And it makes me realise again, it feels really important to process this stuff physically, because it's a physical trauma. It's carried in the body. And for me, therapeutically, before I even started work on the play, that some of the most effective work that I did therapeutically was physical work, body work, really shifting it through the body. And again, it comes back to that thing about resources for healing, and knowing that it's not everyone that gets that. And that's again why I think it's important for me as an activist to do this work, because I've had the privilege in my life to mean I can do all that therapy. Like, I spent a couple of years really going for it, doing talking therapy and physical therapy and this tantra work, and having lots of different kind of healing experiences. So I've come to a place where I am safe, and kind of safe enough to be able to do this on stage. And obviously that's not for everybody, but it feels important to share stories for other people. Madeline once said, and she, says when she's speaking, I think quite often, that for her, she's written a memoir of her story, and she speaks publicly about it now. And she says, I do it for people who haven't yet found their voices, or who aren't able to speak openly about this stuff. And, you know, even the other women whose voices are in the play, I don't think they would stand up and, you know, publicly do it. Their voices are there, but they can still remain anonymous. So it feels powerful to be able to give voice to them as well, to kind of share that platform, I suppose, through the play.
And how has it been in your like personal relationships and with your family and your friends? Because, you know, out of anything that you could have chosen to share with the world and to kind of spend these years being a spokesperson and a channel of, you picked this. And this topic matter, I mean, it hurts other people to know that someone that they love has experienced something. And that's beautiful that there's sympathy and empathy, but also, you know, sometimes that can stop us from sharing because we don't want to upset anyone else. And actually we're fine. Like, we just need to share and go through our process, and you know, we have access to amazing therapy and embodied therapy and these processes. But how was it for you in that space, and what's the response been from the people close to you?
I think in terms of my friends, most of them have just been amazingly supportive and really proud and have appreciated the work. And that's just amazing for me, to have that support network there for people to keep coming and bringing people, bringing friends and wanting to share it. And being really, really supportive of me doing this piece. And I think partly because they see how much I love it, right? And how important it is to me. So when the people that we love and care for are doing things which are exacting and interesting for them, then, you know, that feels good, right? Family is definitely a bit more complex, because I hadn't ever shared what had happened to me with my family, with my parents. And so, you know, I was like, oh, I'm making a play about this, I'm going to have to tell them now, right? Because at some point they're gonna find out. So I was home with my parents one time, and I just figured that this was a time I needed to tell them, and so I did. I said, look, there are these things which have happened to me, and I'm addressing it through therapy, and also I'm making this play. And they were actually both way more open and supportive than I'd expected. I thought there might be resistance because, like you say, you know, it's a big thing to do. I thought they might have been concerned about me. I thought they might not have, you know, they might have feared for my safety in a way. But I think they know that I can look after myself and seek the support that I need.
Often that feeling that we have of shame and that feeling of how awful it would be to share these stories, and how awful that would be received. You know, we're not opening ourselves up to be supported by those that would want to support us if they knew, and that's really powerful.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, for me, going back to also what you said earlier about this sense of like, oh, it wasn't really that bad. You know, for me, I've carried with me for the whole kind of 3 years now that I've been working on this project, this underlying sense that, I'm actually making a fuss. Like, I'm still making a fuss. It's really like nothing happened to me. Why would I even be doing this? Why would I be making this play? But at the same time, and it's also not only the friends that I already had are being like wonderful and supportive, but it's really opened up so many more amazing relationships for me, because, you know, people who've come and seen the play like you and then said, oh, you know, let's have a conversation about it, or people like Nina who've seen it and then introduced me to other activists working in the area and other artists who are sharing stories, like people like Madeline. There's a woman called Winnie M. Lee who has written a novel based on her experiences of sexual assault. I've been directing a play by a woman called Nina Milnes, which is about online abuse. And, you know, I'm meeting incredible people. And to me, that's why, you know, this, you said earlier about the word survivor being like, oh, that's such a kind of icky word. And I think it is for a lot of people. And for me, it's like, I didn't really survive I was never at risk of not surviving. Like I wasn't in mortal danger. So it feels like it's an inappropriate term, but the term victim doesn't sound right for me either. And Winnie, for example, who's written this book, she says I was a victim of that at that time. And I think also, maybe victim is a word for what happens at the time, and then once you've come through it, then I don't know. We don't have the right terminology around it, I think. But
all these words are so loaded.
Yeah.
And that's the whole kind of, just everything around this is so loaded still. But it's amazing. Oprah, obviously, what she said at the Golden Globes about sharing our truth, and then it's amazing that I noticed a few days after that she was just being slated by a load of newspapers and magazines. It's like, okay, let's now let's like shush that down. And it's so interesting, kind of in that thing of we're learning how to respond and to each other and to ourselves. And that weekend of the Facebook really big metoo week, I had 2 incidents that I was sort of part of. One in a group that I was facilitating, where someone had come to me with something that for them was an experience of abuse of power in the workplace. Like nothing had happened but harassment, something that had felt like harassment, and the intention of the man in that situation was not harassment, it was infatuation. but still it was harassment, because it felt like that to the woman who experienced it. And then another situation of an assault, and it struck me that weekend as I was navigating these 2 situations with these 2 groups of people, that okay, this was happening in my life, just one woman, that this must be happening in so many living rooms and workplaces and places all over the Western world, or the Facebook world, because this has triggered something, and people are able to say something, or that feeling like, I'm not holding this in my body anymore. And then that made me feel like, this is how we shift consciousness. I've got 2 situations that I've been given to find a way through, and how I do that and how everyone else that's in that position does that is how consciousness is going to shift. And then with that, it's knowing that we don't know what that way forward is, and so somebody, when they're trying to help, might do something that feels disempowering, and being able to keep that conversation open, so that that person, I'm thinking of a situation where a man tried to help and did something that felt disempowering to the woman in that situation. And it's like, it's not about making that man wrong, but it's about allowing a conversation where, well, that actually didn't feel like the right way to support, but maybe we can figure out what it is together, and opening up that we're entering a new time in the way that we relate to each other as men and women, and in the way that we understand consent. Yeah, absolutely. I hope we are, and we as I said, we've got a long way to go, and there are so many things to bear in mind, right, and to take responsibility for, because we can be sure that on the back of this conversation there'll be a big backlash, right? It always happens, and I'm really interested to know when that's going to come and the form it's going to take. And I think, it's beginning to kind of poke its tendrils through, like this open letter from Catherine Deneuve and her 100 friends who are all saying Me Too's gone too far. It's painting women as pathetic victims who have no way of supporting themselves. It's painting all men as monsters. Too many innocent men are going to fall. Now all you have to do is say that this something happened, but it felt wrong to me, and someone's going to be held responsible for it. And I think, I don't know. I think it's severely misjudged. I think that one only has to have
the slightest experience of being in a situation of harassment to know that the intention is really clear. And I think there's an assumption in there that men can't tell the difference between flirting and aggressive assault. And that's so patronising, and it's so harmful, and it's so really, so wrong. And I think that, we have to be really conscious in moving towards, in actually, like you say, really listening to each other, really with empathy. What is it that's happened? How is it that person has been made to feel? What is it that they want in terms of moving forward? To not be prescriptive, to not kind of jump into some kind of survival mode where we have to make things better. We have to know that we're in it for a long ride, and hopefully there is this, and I really feel it, as I've said, that there is a shift taking place, and we are moving into something different and new and more positive and hopefully more balanced. But we have to be really attentive in that shift, right? To the nuances. And this, this is something which keeps coming up for me as well. This conversation is there are so many nuances. It's so complex. It's such a complex issue. Every feeling and every moment of any kind of assault or harassment situation is so complex that obviously the conversations that lead it are going to be complex. Obviously the fallout is going to be hugely complicated. It takes resources, it takes time. We have to be willing to be open to that and not feel like we have all the answers or should have all the answers, and to be soft and open in a way. I don't know, it all sounds quite inconclusive and inconcrete, and I guess because it is, right? Because we don't really know how things might shift and how we can move on and what is next. And, what do we have to do? This is something that came up in a conversation recently. Are we ready to take responsibility for the fallout of this? Are we ready to catch or support all the women or the children whose partners or husbands or fathers are falling, I don't have this kind of dread that so many innocent men are going to fall, because again, the stats don't support that. There are still so many abusive men in positions of power, like Donald Trump, Woody Allen, Roman Polanski. Like, there are loads of people who haven't gone down in this. There are loads that, and they have absurd amounts of power. And look at how long it took for Weinstein to fall. Statistically, we're not going to rub out and erase and destroy loads of innocent men in this. But when men who are, and maybe just with a level of notoriety, so not so successful that it's going to be easy for their families, we have to be really conscious and mindful of what's going to happen to their families, actually, because they're not part of it, but they're going to suffer. So there's a huge responsibility that goes along with this. It's really complex. It's really, it's not going to be easy. But we've begun now, and we have to, just...
Well, and the personal healing is the most important part for survivors and perpetrators and everyone in between. To feel into what in them needs to be healed in their relationship with consent, in their relationship with the other sex, or maybe the same sex, depending on what it is. But that's where we can all start.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another thing which Dr. Nina Burrows has said on a panel at Foreign Body at the Play, which was that we kind of accept, I guess, that a lot of people who perpetrate have themselves been victims in the past. And one of the things that she says around this is, if I were made to violate another person sexually, I would be seriously messed up after that, right? So we have to also understand that people who perpetrate, there's a level of trauma in that for them as well. I don't think it's the primary kind of issue, obviously, because they've taken that step and they need to take some kind of responsibility. But like in the story of the perpetrator whose voice is in my play, he's carried that ever since it happened and continues to. And I don't think that's the case for everybody in that position. I think some people are probably capable of doing that and not feeling guilty. Maybe they don't necessarily realise that what they've done was assault, but I think in a lot of cases people do. And that's going to mess with their heads. That's going to be really disturbing. So like you said, we need some way of finding, I guess there are these treatment centres, but we need to find ways of addressing their healing as well. That's the only way that we're going to actually change anything. We can support victims and survivors, but that's still like curative rather than preventative. But we have to start preventing this stuff, not by, by calling it out and by having systems in place and all this kind of thing, but also by having healing available for people who are at risk of perpetrating. I have no idea how to go about that, but I think it's a big part of our work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's key, and an example that I saw recently on Twitter was somebody sent Sarah Silverman some abuse on Twitter, and instead of her, blocking him, she just wrote to him, and then there was a bit of back and forth, and then she, found people in the area that would go and support him, and that's the thing. It's like yes, we need to process our personal and our collective pain and our rage and everything that comes up, but then there's also with that and compassion and that understanding that the perpetrator pain and rage is in the same pot, and that we're processing that as well. Because
otherwise we're building these monsters, right? It goes back to this idea that perpetrators are these evil outliers and they have nothing to do with us. But they're not. They're just normal, everyday people. Yeah. And if 1 in 3 women are survivors of sexual assault, then, and obviously there are people that perpetrate multiply, but there's got to be close to that in terms of people who perpetrate. So we have to start accepting that they're people that we know and love and figuring out what we want to do about that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad we got to the compassion. It's a good place to end the conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you, Imogen.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for opening up the conversation.
And for those in London that want to go and see your play, that's happening in March?
Yeah, it's the 7th to the 11th of March at the Vault Festival, and you can find tickets through the website, which is foreignbodyplay.com.
And we have friends listening from all over the world, so anyone listening that really wants to see and experience this piece of incredible, evocative theatre, maybe you can write to Imogen through her website, and maybe invite her to come out to your country and put on a production.
Yeah, I'm definitely touring on the road.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our community. If you loved this and would like to contribute to our Patreon campaign or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes so we can grow. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together.